In Acts 3, 1 through 6, we find the following. United, Peter and John went up to the temple at the hour of prayer, the ninth hour. They were approaching the gate of the temple called the Beautiful Gate, where daily a certain man, lame from birth, was stationed that he might ask alms of those entering the temple. And seeing Peter and John about to go into the temple, he asked to receive alms. And Peter directed his gaze at him, as did John, and said, "Look at us." And he fixed his attention on them, expecting to receive something from them. But Peter said, "Silver and gold have I none, but what I do have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk." Now, there's much more to this story than that. But last week we stopped at this point and focused our attention on these 6 words spoken by Peter. The words, "Silver and gold have I none," because words have meaning. And the plain meaning of Peter's words here, the most obvious way to take what he says here is, I do not have the means to help you financially. Now, he does help the man. And for most Christians, for most readers, that's the point. And that makes any question about Peter's opening words here moot. Makes any question unimportant, because he healed the man, gave him mobility for the first time in his life. And this miracle added 2,000 households to the Jerusalem church, and it got Peter and John an audience with the Sanhedrin. So what does it matter what Peter meant when he said, "Silver and gold have I none"? Well, as I explained last week, it matters because words have meaning. And truthful propositions are the foundation upon which reasonable faith is based. And if what Peter meant when he said, "Silver and gold have I none," was, I do not have access to the means to help you financially, that's a problem, because that is a propositionally false statement. Because the testimony of Acts 2, 44 through 45, and Acts 4, 32 through 35 is that when Peter spoke these words, he had access to the assets of 3,000 believing households, which assets had been liquidated and the proceeds laid at the apostles' feet for them to distribute as they saw fit. Now, if that had happened today in this culture, the value of those assets would have been north of $350 million. And though the average Jewish household in first century Palestine did not have the purchasing power of the average 21st century American household, nevertheless, it is safe to assume that the commercial weight of a day's wages in that economy would have been comparable to the commercial weight of a day's wages in our economy. And the liquidated assets of 3,000 households from any economy is a whale of a lot of money in that economy. And that being the case, Peter, being the chief executive officer in charge of the distribution of those assets, absolutely had access to the means to help the lame man financially. So why did he say what he said? Why did he start his discourse in Acts 3 with a statement that could be so readily and so easily falsified? Now, that's where we left off last week. That's the question I was addressing as our time came to an end last week. And I have to tell you that from where I'm standing, from where I was standing last week, it appeared to me that that question landed with a resounding thud to those who were watching and listening. I mean, I've preached a lot of sermons. I've seen a lot of different kinds of reactions to things that I've said from the pulpit, but last week was a first for me. Before last week, I've never seen a congregation evacuate the church building while wearing dispassionate smiles. But it wasn't disengagement. It wasn't boredom. I've seen that before. It wasn't disapproval. It wasn't disagreement. That I've seen before too. It was more like discomfiture. Which unease, which dis-ease was made clear to me by Rich, who sent me a long email Sunday afternoon in which he attempted to articulate all the different ways in which last week's lesson affected him, ranging from arousing deep-seated fears of being misunderstood to a sense of dismay about how words are being deliberately and aggressively redefined by activists in our culture, to a sense of disillusionment about the holy poverty of the apostles, and everything in between. And his closing paragraph began with the words, "Yes, you struck a deep emotional place in me today, my dear brother, whom I now call come back next week Joe." So I want to start today by relieving the tension that I built up with last week's lesson and saying, no, obviously, I do not believe that Peter's aim with the words, "silver and gold have I none," was to be deceptive. And I gave you reasons for that at the end of last week's lesson. The evidence simply does not support any charge that Peter was being disingenuous. He did not mean to say there is no money in the church treasury. And that's good, both because it means that Peter did not lie and because there was money in the church treasury, which, as I teach on this over the next few weeks, you will come to understand is a good thing. So what did Peter mean by those 6 words? Well, the answer to that, I think, lies in Acts 2:44 through 45 and 4:32 through 35, where we find the following. "And all that believed were together, and held all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and distributed them to all the people as every person had need. And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and one soul, Neither did any of them say that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they held all things in common. And with great power the apostles gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Neither was there any among them that lacked. For as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made unto every person according to individual need." In the early church, in the first church, in the Jerusalem church, all the believers held all things in common. No one said that aught of the things that he possessed was his own. And that was an ethic that was shared not just by the people, but by the apostles in general, and Peter in particular. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because when Peter in Acts 3 was personally presented with a financial need outside the church, he responded by saying, "Silver and gold have I none." And he said that even though he had access to vast amounts of money. And why? Well, because even though that money had been laid at his feet to distribute as he saw fit, he did not consider it to be his own money. He considered it to be community property. And the community to which that money belonged, in Peter's mind, was not the great big brotherhood of man. No, the community to which that money belonged was the church. And as such, Peter did not feel free to give any of it to anyone who was not part of that community. And the lame man was not, in Acts 3:6, yet part of that community. And if Peter had given the man any money, then he would have been violating church policy. And this brings us to where we left off last week. Because as you may recall, last week I told you that there are 4 ways, or at least 4 ways, that words can be misleading. First, words can be misleading by accident. For instance, thrift is frugality. And those who are thrifty are frugal in their spending. So if you didn't know better, you might think that a spendthrift is someone who's downright parsimonious in their spending, stingy, penny pinching in their spending. But in truth, a spendthrift is someone who spends money in an extravagant way. And this is a word that can be misleading by accident. Second, words can be misleading by convention. So for instance, if you get a wedding announcement that says save the date, but does not tell you the location of the wedding and does not invite you to RSVP, what that means is that the date has been provided for you to save as a deadline by which you are invited to give a gift to the happy couple. But you should not presume that you're invited to attend the wedding unless and until you receive further correspondence giving you not just the date, but the time and location of the wedding. And even then, you should not presume that you're invited to the reception. Plan on attending the reception only if you receive a reception RSVP. All of this is because the convention of wedding etiquette has changed. And if you do not understand the new convention, the words "save the date" may mislead you into believing that you've been invited to attend. Third, words can be misleading by design. And this is simply another way of saying that words are misleading if they are deceptive, if they are untruthful, if they're false. And fourth, words can be misleading not because they're deceptive, but because they are misapprehended by the hearer. Because we all bring certain assumptions with us to any conversation. I mean, you've all heard the old riddle. A father and son are in a horrible car crash that kills the dad. The son is rushed to the hospital. Just as he's about to go under the knife, the surgeon says, "Wait, I can't operate on this patient. That boy is my son. Explain." Now, you've all heard this riddle before, and you all know that the surgeon is the boy's mother. But suppose that I said to you, "I have never lost a bridge tournament." What might you think then about my bridge skill level? Well, if you assume that I'm a bridge player, you might infer that that statement indicates that I'm highly skilled at the game. But if you assume that I'm a novice, you might infer that the reason I've never lost a bridge tournament is because I've never entered a tournament. Now, in a case like that, the assumptions of the hearer really matter. Not all assumptions are equal. In the case of the riddle of the surgeon, the first time I heard that riddle was way back in 1975, and it was being put forth by Sally Struthers on All in the Family. Now, the point of the riddle in that context was to make Archie Bunker look like a misogynist, which was really easy to do because he was a misogynist. But he needn't have been prejudiced in any way to be stumped by the riddle. After all, in 1975, only about 2% of all doctors in the U.S. were female. And without going into any of the reasons why that might have been the case, it's safe to say that separate and apart from any sense of ought, and separate and apart from any conscious sense of gender bias, the experiential norm for the vast majority of people at that time was that doctors were men. And for most people, when they heard the solution to the riddle, it was not mind-blowing. It wasn't even paradigm-shattering. No, nobody apart from Archie Bunker lost their minds or argued the point at all. For most people, once they realized the boy's mother was the surgeon, they simply said, "Oh, yeah, duh. Why didn't I think of that?" For most people, the fact that it did not occur to them that the surgeon could be the boy's mother was slightly embarrassing and somewhat enlightening. But it's a different matter for the example with the bridge tournament, because my statement that I have never lost a bridge tournament implies that I have, in fact, competed at the tournament level. And by social contract, no one who had not so competed would make such a statement, except for the purposes of misleading his hearers. Well, Peter's statement, "Silver and gold have I none," was neither false nor deceptive, but it was misleading, at least in the sense that it led people to draw conclusions that were false, which misunderstanding led indirectly to the deaths of two members of the Jerusalem church, Ananias and Sapphira, because somehow they came to be under the impression that holding nothing to be one's own was a law of sorts, when in fact it was never anything more than Peter's personal policy, which policy was adopted by the majority of their peers. Now, I want to stop there for just a minute and talk about that for just a moment, about policy and law. You see, beloved, there's a difference between law and policy. And here I'm not talking about company policy. And the way that, for instance, a company you have a dispute with will cite their own policy as though it were law, that they're bound by it and their hands are tied. That is a semantic legerdemain at its worst and most cynical. It's a topic for another sermon. And I'm not talking about regulatory agencies or commissions. Yes, I'm well aware that there are agencies such as OSHA, which are empowered by the legislature to regulate certain industries, and that they have a tendency to engage in regulatory overreach, and have been known to impose policies which actually violate statute law or even the Constitution. And that's a real problem, but that isn't what I'm talking about today either. When I refer to the differences between law and policy, I'm referring to the differences between the letter of the law and the way that the law is enforced. For instance, June 10, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act into law. Now, I was born in August of 1963, so literally for my entire life it has been the law of this land that men and women should receive equal pay for equal work. However, in 2020, 57 years later, another equal pay bill was introduced. Now, why was this new bill introduced? Well, because a plethora of studies conducted and published in the intervening years demonstrated that despite equal pay being the law of the land, there's been a persistent gap in the pay of women as compared to the pay of men in the same or similar jobs. Now, I realize that many of those studies are flawed, that they ask the wrong questions and omit obvious questions, and they don't tend to account for the biological conspiracy of childbirth or other data points that make real gender differences. Nevertheless, the data yielded by those studies was sufficient to persuade a number of lawmakers that more legislation was needed, because apparently the bottom line conclusion of these studies was that the Equal Pay Act of 1963 was simply not being enforced. And even though there appeared to be overwhelming evidence that violations of the Equal Pay Act were being committed on an ongoing basis across the board in almost all areas of the economy, the data was not sufficient to compel any attorney general for 6 decades to enforce the law more vigorously. Because as rampant as violations seem to have been, one would think that there would have been an endless stream of prosecutions going on, that the heads of CEOs would have been rolling all day, every day, for the 217 years since the act was passed. But quite apparently that was not happening, and there are really only 2 explanations for that. Either the data was false, and these alleged violations weren't actually occurring, or there was simply no will on the part of the Justice Department to enforce the law. Beloved, that is a difference between law and policy. Law is the letter of the law, and policy is how the law is enforced. And examples of this abound. One obvious example has to do with our immigration laws. The United States has always had immigration laws, and the immigration laws of the U.S. have always been largely ignored and unevenly applied. I mean, how else do you suppose we got to the point that we have 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country? By diligent enforcement of the law? No. By selective, even if broadly, selectively enforcing and ignoring the law. That's been our national policy for all of my life. The law says one thing, but the policy, which is unwritten, says another. Now, it's been that way for a long time, and at some point we're going to have to come to terms with that problem. And the reason we have to come to terms with it is because standing in the gap between the letter of the law and the actual policy of the nation, there are real people. Real people with real lives trying to navigate waters of uncertainty. Now, every now and again, we decide to try to close the gap between law and policy on this matter, but whenever that happens, there are people standing between the two who get squeezed and who get squeezed hard. And we want to hold them responsible for ignoring the law, but we never seem to be able to hold ourselves responsible for ignoring the law. The people who are responsible for the weak policy never stand up and take responsibility for their policies. No, what they say is, yes, they broke the law, but let's have compassion on them. But they never stand up and say, wait a minute, this is really our fault. Those people are caught in the middle because we set a policy of ignoring the law. We created this gap. All they did was walk into it. And this will remain a problem as long as there remains a gap between law and policy. Now, lest all this sounds too political, and I understand why you would think I'm getting political here, that's not the point. But unless it seems like it's too political or too big of a problem to really contemplate in its fullness, let's bring this back down to a simpler and more straightforward example. An example that I used recently, but I want to apply it in a different way today, because I know that there's a difference between law and policy when it comes to enforcing the speed limit. We all know that whatever the speed limit is, most police forces will grant you to exceed that speed by a certain amount before they issue you a ticket. And that's generally understood to be 5 or 10 miles per hour. Now, I don't count on 10 miles per hour. Some people do, but I don't. But I certainly count on a 5 mile per hour tolerance. And make no mistake about it, that allowance for extra speed is not grace. Tolerance and grace are not the same thing. And if you think they are, you have not been listening to one whit of what I've been saying for the last 15 years. The point is that if the speed limit is 65, most of us will set our cruise control on 70, some on 75 with no compunction and with no fear of punishment. But if you're clocked going 80 in a 65, that tolerance level dissolves. It goes out the window. You don't get held responsible just for the 5 miles per hour difference between the tolerance level of 75 and your speed of 80. No, you have to pay the penalty for the full 15 miles per hour. That's the difference between law and policy. Nevertheless, knowing the policy and having benefited from it all of our lives, we feel entitled to its leniency. Now, this I know from personal experience. I was raised in Wichita, Kansas, and Kansas is a state which is rife with the pettiest sort of politics. And if there are any Kansans listening to me right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because you see, Wichita is the most highly populated place in the state, but it is the least popular. Indeed, for the rest of Kansas, hating Wichita and its residents is practically a hobby. Here just a few years ago, the city of Wichita put a municipal sales tax on the ballot. Now, there's a state law on the books in Kansas which says that any municipality that imposes a municipal tax will no longer be eligible for state funds. Well, I don't know how old or how obscure that law is, but it's old enough and obscure enough that the city attorney of Wichita was unaware of it, and his legal team did not discover it in the process of aiding the city council in writing this bill. But the state attorney general knew all about it, and he said nothing. The ballot was in the news for months before the vote, and the state attorney general knew the whole time that if it passed, Wichita would be in a world of hurt. But he said nothing. He never so much as picked up the phone to call anybody in Wichita city government to tell them what this levy would do to that city until the day after the election, when the bill had passed. Then the Kansas AG sent a memo to the city of Wichita, to the city manager, informing him that Wichita was now no longer eligible for state funds and giving him the cutoff date when the spigot would be turned off. That's how deep anti-Sedgwick County sentiment in Kansas runs, and it goes way back. It goes way back. In 1955, when the KTA built the Kansas Turnpike, they built it with no practical Wichita exits. It passed by to the south and east of the city, But if you wanted to get on the turnpike, you had to drive to Mulvane or to El Dorado. In addition, Kansas once had the most sophisticated license plate system in the country. It was organized by county and by the last name of the owner of the car. So every license plate I ever had prior to about 1990 had the same three-letter prefix, SGB. SG for Sedgwick County and B for Becker. And because of this, any law enforcement officer could see at a glance what county you were from. And nowhere in the state was anti-Sedgwick County sentiment higher than in Butler County, where Wichita dwellers, where Wichitans traveling north had to get off the turnpike. We had to exit at El Dorado and take 254 to Wichita. And I found myself on that road fairly late one night in 1975, when Dave Williams was sheriff of Butler County. Now, as you know, sheriff is an elected position, and Sheriff Williams held that position for a good while, election after election, and one of the reasons he was so popular in Butler County was because he had figured out a new and inventive way to stick it to Sedgwick County residents. Because in 1974, the federal government changed the national speed limit to 55. When that happened, just about every police department in the country agreed to adopt a policy of allowing drivers 5 to 10 miles per hour leeway before giving them a ticket. So just about everywhere in the nation, drivers felt secure driving 60 or some places 65, wherever they went, pretty certain that they would not be ticketed. Sometime around 1977 or 78, about the time I started driving, Sheriff Williams decided to break that social contract with Sedgwick County drivers. And overnight, he became Kansas famous. He was even featured on stories on Cake TV News for giving out tickets to Wichitans for driving 56 miles per hour through Butler County on Highway 254. And he could easily spot them because of their license plates. Well, in the spring of 1975, when I was 16 years old, I went to a forensics tournament at Emporia State University with the forensics team from my school. And shortly after we got there, our two sponsors, Mr. Brown and Mr. Fredine, disappeared. We didn't know where they were or what they were doing. We just knew that the van was gone and they were gone with it. But after the awards ceremony, we came outside and found them, passed out drunk, on the floor of the van. Now, later we found out that what they had done was that they had bought a watermelon and had injected it with vodka. And their plan was to bring that watermelon back to the school and snack on it all afternoon, supposedly and hopefully undetected by other teachers and sponsors. Well, the temptation of the vodka melon overtook them, and they never made it back inside the building. Now, I was a take charge kind of guy. I took charge. I retrieved the keys from Mr. Brown's pocket along with his wallet, and after we allowed his credit card to treat us all to dinner, I got in the driver's seat and took us all home. And I made it back as far as Butler County without incident. But when we got to El Dorado, we pulled off the turnpike onto 254 for the final stretch into Wichita. And before long, I found myself behind Sheriff Williams' car. And true to form, he was driving about 52 miles per hour, trying to lure people into passing him. But I wasn't going to bite. I knew the game, and I wasn't going to play. I stayed back a full 3 or 4 seconds. Every time he slowed down, I slowed down. Till finally we were both going about 25 miles per hour on the road. Then he put on his lights and motioned for me to pull over, which I did. Now, it turns out that the reason he pulled me over was because this rental van had a headlight out. Well, I got the rental agreement and the rental insurance out of the glove box and handed these to him along with my license when he came to the window. But just as he approached the window, Mr. Brown came to and stood up on his knees behind my seat and began trying to explain to the sheriff about what was happening in his drunken voice. And that was not helpful. Well, Sheriff Williams asked me to step out of the vehicle, which I did, and I told him the whole story. And over the course of us having this conversation, I could see his demeanor changing. He could see the situation that I was in. And he explained to me all the charges that could be brought against Mr. Ferdine and Mr. Brown and me for driving a rental van, not being 25 years of age, which was the law in Kansas at the time. But then he looked at me and he said, "Mr. Becker, looks like you've got a clean driving record and you appear to be a safe driver. Do you promise to get all these people home safely?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I will, I promise." And he said, "Okay, I'm going to escort you to the county line. And then I'm going to trust you to do as you have said. But if you fail in your mission, you're on your own. These people's lives are in your hands. Don't screw it up." And he issued no citations. He let me go. He escorted me to the county line and sent me on my way, and I completed my mission. Now, I don't know why he showed me the mercy that he did. I don't know why his demeanor changed. I don't know what changed his mind or his general attitude. I don't know exactly what kind of trouble he might have gotten into for letting us go, as he did if anything had gone wrong in my end after he let us go. But that day he chose to follow a personal policy rather than the law. And that policy was beneficial to me. I've always been grateful to him for that. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, what's the point of this lesson? Well, this is part 2 in a 3-part lesson. And I promise that everything will come full circle next week, because next week I'm going to tie all this together by seeding it in the report of what happened with Ananias and Sapphira. Now, the connection between that and what I've said so far may seem less than obvious to you. So allow me to tip my hand a little bit, give you a couple of hints about next week's lesson. And in the process, let me give you something to hang your hat on for today's lesson. You see, beloved, there's always a difference between law and policy. There's always a space between the two. And that space generally tends to be beneficial to some people and harmful to others. And whenever we step into that space, the space between law and policy, we're in no man's land, where it can be really difficult to discern up from down. And it can be really difficult to know whether you are going to benefit or be harmed by the difference between law and policy. Well, that brings us back to Peter and where this lesson began. Because when it comes to New Testament giving, when it comes to giving under the new covenant, there is no law, except the law that we are free to give as we are impelled from within, for God loves a cheerful giver. But in the earliest days of the church, there was a clear policy. And that policy was articulated by Peter in public in Acts 3:6 when he said, "Silver and gold have I none." And the policy was, nothing is to be considered your own. Everything belongs to the Lord. Everything belongs to the church, and ideally, everything should be given to the church. And the testimony of Acts 2 and 4 is that policy was all but universally accepted and adopted by the members of the Jerusalem church. But beloved, that policy is miles apart from the law of giving as articulated elsewhere in the New Testament. However, as far as we know, the law of giving, which is far less exacting than Peter's policy, wasn't ever clearly laid out until Acts 5:4, when Peter articulated it to Ananias, saying, "Didn't the land belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, weren't you free to use the money as you wished? And in the meantime, between Acts 3 and 5, Ananias and Sapphira were living in no man's land, in the space between law and policy. And for them, the difference between law and policy turned out to be the difference between life and death. It turned out to be a matter of life and death. Now, I don't believe that the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira were inevitable in Acts 2:44 through 45, when we first learn of the policy of the church in regard to giving. But in Acts 3:6, when Peter said in public, "Silver and gold have I none," the die was pretty much cast. That's when the church crossed the Rubicon on the way to the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira. And I'll explain more about that next week. That's my lesson for today.